Thank you all for coming. This talk is Are Cryptids Real? A Zoological Perspective. My name is Joshua Shipp. I'm a biology faculty here at AVC. And I kind of wanted to do this talk because I'm interested in cryptozoology, and I also think it's kind of a fun Halloween-like talk to go over. So let's take a look at some cryptids. So during this talk, I'm first going to go through what is cryptozoology, for those of you who maybe don't know that much about this field. Then we're going to go through the history of this field, what cryptozoology looks like today, and then I'm going to do kind of a fun survey of cryptids, going from most ordinary kinds of animals to more bizarre animals. And I'll end with answering this question of, are cryptids actually real? So cryptozoology is defined as the study of hidden animals or cryptids. And what this means is species which may exist or may not actually exist. Although cryptozoology sounds like zoology, the study of animals, cryptozoology is not really accepted as a science or as a field of biology. In fact, a lot of people view it as a pseudoscience. So something that kind of pretends to be a science, but for various reasons, doesn't have good premises. Sometimes it's even classified as a paranormal belief. Like in this study from Chapman University, they surveyed people's belief in different paranormal things. For one thing, they found Bigfoot was a pretty rare belief. About 16% of people surveyed, which is less than believing in aliens or in ghosts or that Atlantis existed, which was pretty high. So they classified believing in something like Bigfoot as a paranormal belief. So how is cryptozoology different from a traditional zoological investigation? So typically, cryptozoology functions by looking for species responsible for folk tales and personal accounts. So it kind of starts with, let's take a look at some folklore creatures that people talk about in various cultures. Or maybe there's been some sightings or accounts that people have of encountering some strange creature. So it starts with that and then tries to find the creature actually responsible for that. Biologists may also search for new species, but this is usually done in a very different way, in an organized, methodical way, where they go to a particular region and they just survey it carefully and catalog everything that they find. So for example, going in Brazil and searching, and in the process of examining a particular region of Brazil, discovering 3 new species of wasps, or searching through New Guinea and cataloging new species encountered and finding 200 new species. So it's not like they're looking for something specific. They just know this is a region that hasn't been cataloged very carefully. And so they go there to try and see what they can find. So a new species of moss or wasp or frog is of great interest to biologists, but that's not usually what cryptozoologists are interested in. Cryptid hunters want to find something really weird, a mysterious creature, something that's less likely to exist, like a living dinosaur or a monster. So these kinds of almost fantasy-seeming creatures are usually what cryptozoologists are interested in. The term cryptozoology is fairly recent. It dates back to the 1950s, and it was coined by 2 zoologists. So Dr. Bernard Heuvelmans and Ivan T. Sanderson, who wrote the first cryptozoology books. Here are some of the first ones. I actually have those right here as part of my collection. So you can see here's Heuvelmans' book, and this is Ivan T. Sanderson's book. So if you come in person, you can actually see what these books are like. So it got started by actual zoologists. Both of these men were not just zoologists, they were also interested in folklore and stories that people told of interesting and mysterious animals, which got them interested in looking for creatures like Bigfoot or Yeti. But although cryptozoology with that name is relatively recent, Scholars and people who are interested in cryptozoology would say that this kind of investigation, a cryptozoological investigation, has been around for much longer. If you really look into the past, a lot of animals that we accept as real, ordinary animals today, like giant squids, mountain gorillas, giant pandas, Komodo dragons, platypuses, were at one time thought to be monsters. They were thought to be creatures of the imagination, creatures that likely did not actually exist. In fact, a lot of times when they heard stories of mountain gorillas or giant squids, a lot of the scientific community said, this is not a real animal. For example, in the 1840s, there was a Danish zoologist, Johan Steenstrup, and he was really interested in the giant squid. At that point, it was not a creature that biologists accepted as an actual living creature. It was a creature of legend, like the Kraken, this giant squid-like monster that would attack boats. But he thought it was something real. So he actually went and talked to people that saw giant squids. Usually it was giant squids that had died coming up on the beach. And eventually he actually found one, a dead giant squid, because he had been communicating with people and following up on sightings. He found a giant squid that was dead, washed up on the beach, and he described it. But at that time, the rest of the scientific community kind of thought he was crazy, that this was not an actual real animal. Similarly, scientists and explorers went out to search for gorillas based on African stories and previous sightings. Again, the general scientific community thought these creatures were just fantasy creatures, like elves or gnomes, until eventually a hunter shot a gorilla and brought it back to Europe in 1902. So that was when gorillas kind of became, from the scientific community's perspective, a real animal. Before then, it was just thought of as some mystical creature that was present in African folklore. You can see here are some of the drawings of these first encounters with gorillas. And the drawings are not that good because, you know, they kind of didn't have a great idea of what these creatures were. Again, Western explorers searched for monstrous land crocodiles, these figures from stories and folklore and accounts from Indonesian fishermen. But a lot of people thought, again, these were just fantasy creatures. And it wasn't until 1926 that naturalists managed to bring back one of these land crocodiles, which then became known as Komodo dragons. They were brought to the United States for examination. And here was the first of these Komodo dragons that was brought in. But that was 1926. So if you actually look at the history of explorers and naturalists, in the past, scientists were willing to do this type of investigation, to look into sightings and stories and to search for the real creatures responsible, which is kind of the definition of a cryptozoological investigation. But now such tactics, according to most scientists, would be regarded as pseudoscience. So why is that? Why is this field that was started by two zoologists kind of earn this reputation as something outside of science? Well, part of the reason is because this cryptozoology field has been really popular. And a lot of people have liked it who are not just professional scientists. And so it's kind of gotten tied up with aliens, with supernatural forces. You know, these are some real books: The Psychic Sasquatch, The Supernatural Sasquatch, The Bigfoot Alien Connection Revealed. So there's a lot of interest in this field from people that are not careful, who are not precise, who are not trained scientists. A lot of cryptid researchers also do science badly. A lot of times they're going out to try and prove something they want to be true. And they're not necessarily being really careful about the evidence that they will accept. They might believe in a cryptid based on faulty evidence, and they might be unlikely to accept evidence to the contrary. So for example, there was a frozen Bigfoot that was discovered in 2008 and had videos of it, but then it turned out to just be a gorilla suit. But some people believed it without investigating more to make sure this evidence was actually real. So there's kind of a lack of being careful in the evidence that they will accept. So does this fact that some people doing these investigations, some cryptid hunters, are non-scientific scientific and vulnerable to hoaxes, does that mean overall the field of cryptozoology is a waste of time? So can this field be scientific? Well, one thing that's true is that cryptozoologists can be scientists. They can be people with degrees in science and expertise. Like these are a couple of the biggest cryptozoologists in the world today. Lauren Coleman, who has a degree in zoology and anthropology. And this is Carl Schuker, who wrote a lot of interesting books, who has a PhD in zoology. So you can be a scientist and follow the scientific method and also do investigations into cryptozoology. I would say that doing this kind of investigation, investigating unknown species based on folklore or local sightings, there's nothing unscientific about it in and of itself. If you have a lot of indirect evidence, a lot of accounts, a long history of consistent folklore, it's reasonable to take these accounts seriously and to try to search for the creature or creatures responsible, as scientists and explorers did in the past. By following this kind of procedure, we got the discovery of the Komodo dragon as detailed here. We got the discovery of the platypus. When naturalists first brought platypuses into Europe, a lot of scientists didn't actually believe those specimens, even when they saw them, because it seemed like it was just a hoax, a bunch of animals, the bill of a duck, and you had like a beaver or something, all kind of glued together. So it took a while for even them with physical evidence to accept that this was a real animal. And the truth is, mainstream scientists still kind of do this type of investigation sometimes, even though overall the community kind of treats cryptozoology as if it's something completely non-scientific. So there are scientists who will do this. They'll follow sightings, they'll follow indigenous knowledge to discover new species. So for example, there was a paleontologist, Mario Kozul. He found a new species of tapir in 2013. The way he did it is he talked to the local Pamari tribe, and they told him, we know that you scientists know about this tapir and this tapir, but there's actually another tapir out there that you don't know about. You don't have a name for, but we do. And he talked to them and he followed where they said this tapir lived, and eventually he discovered that it was real. Here it is. And it became documented. So this is following a cryptozoological style investigation and discovering a pretty big new species of mammal. Similarly, there was a new species of owl that was discovered on an island off the coast of Western Africa recently. And again, this discovery was made thanks to talking to the local people. There was a local ranger, Bike Gila. He had been searching for this owl based on sightings and stories and accounts of this owl going back to 1928. And so he really provided a lot of clues as to where this owl would be found, what should it look like, and eventually it was discovered as a real bird right here. So he's using this type of investigation, listening to local people, listening to accounts, listening to folklore that led to these discoveries. Okay, so that's a little history into what cryptozoology is. So now let's take a look at some specific cryptids. And I'm going to survey some major cryptids today. And if you're interested in this talk, I'm going to do a part 2 next Friday where I'll look at a whole bunch of other cryptids. And as we do this, I want us to kind of maintain a balance of skepticism, but not outright dismissing observations made by other people. So trying to find what's the most likely explanation without completely discounting the experiences and observations and folklore that exists out there. And I'm going to give my own subjective assessment for a lot of these cryptids based on my judgment, based on what I know about animals, kind of from a zoologist's perspective. And I think it'll make sense to go from relatively normal cryptids that don't take a lot of kind of imagination to think as something real, to more extreme cryptids that kind of seem less likely to exist. So as much as cryptozoology, people usually think of, Bigfoot or the Loch Ness monster, kind of really extreme sort of mystical seeming creatures. Cryptozoology is not just concerned with that. It's also concerned with species if they're found in the wrong place, especially if they're large, dangerous, or interesting species. So if you find a shark in freshwater, or as we'll see, a jaguar seemingly out of place, or an alligator in a sewer, that's interesting to a cryptozoologist, even though it's not actually a new species. So one really big kind of popular category of cryptids is called alien big cats, or ABCs. And these are usually large cats, like lions or panthers, that are found in a region where they're not supposed to live. Especially this is common in the US or the UK. And there's hundreds of these sightings every year in these two countries, especially of large black cats. So this is a map just showing kind of the region of Texas. These are all sightings of large black cats going across 10 years from 2010 to 2019. And these are some recent sightings of big cats in the United Kingdom. So let's first look at the example of the United States. The United States is home to a lot of cat species, like these guys here. There's mountain lions, we have bobcats, we have lynxes, as well as domestic cats. If you're talking about a large black cat, well, the biggest cat we have, that would be native to the United States is a mountain lion. But mountain lions are not black. There's never been a mountain lion that has been known to have black coloration. And can sometimes happen in lynxes, but it's extremely rare. So if there is a big black cat roaming around the United States, what could that be? So I want to show you a couple pieces of photographic evidence. This is from Michigan a couple years ago of a seemingly large black cat. And this is a video of a large black cat, what they call black panther from Arkansas.
There's a black panther in it. Huge.
Okay, so there's a couple examples of black cats in the United States. Now let's talk about what could explain these cats in the United States. Now, I think the easiest explanation is just to say everybody's wrong, right? These cats are just house cats, just black house cats that may be a little bit bigger on average, or maybe people are mistaking the size of them from looking at them. But some of them are definitely sightings of larger cats. Like we know it can happen that a big cat is roaming around the United States. If they escape from a zoo, or if they have, a person has a private collection of exotic animals and cats get out, like these are documented examples from Texas, 2021, of an escaped tiger was roaming around the neighborhood. In Ohio, this was a really sad story, but there was someone that had a huge collection of exotic pets. And I think the person went crazy and just released all of them. And so police ended up gunning down a lot of these pets, including this lion in 2011. Whoops. And this actually is fairly common. So in the United States since 1990, in fact, 20 people have been killed because of escaped exotic cats, and over 200 people have been injured. So for example, in the San Francisco Zoo, a tiger got out and ended up killing a visitor. So it does sometimes happen that we know of that big cats get released and they end up roaming around in the United States. But does that explain all of the sightings? That's my question. I'm going to suggest that one hypothesis we should consider is, what if some of these big black cats are actually jaguars? And there is some evidence to back this up. Jaguars are really big cats. They're the third largest cat in the world after tigers and lions. And unlike mountain lions, they can be black quite frequently. So here's a black jaguar right here. And they are pretty big, tough animals. This is a jaguar killing a crocodile from Brazil. Up until the 1990s, it was believed that jaguars were basically extinct in the United States, killed off primarily because of hunting, because people, Americans had campaigns to eradicate large predators, not just jaguars, but also mountain lions and other predators as well. And also habitat loss. But you can see the former range of jaguars went way up into the southwestern United States, including into California. But now the current range is kind of like cut mostly to Mexico and into Central and South America. But recent evidence suggests that jaguars are starting to come back. They're starting to go back into America from Mexico. So this is an example of one of these jaguars that people have documented called El Jefe that lives in Arizona, and based on evidence from his droppings is known to eat bears as a primary food source, so a pretty tough jaguar. There was another jaguar that people knew about, but that one was actually killed by farmers. But there might be more. These are just the ones that have been photographed. But I just want to show you a little bit of what this El Jefe looks like. So yeah, just 25 miles from Tucson, Arizona. Roaming around the mountains there. Okay, so I think that's an explanation worth considering, especially since a lot of these sightings are in Texas, which is just right across from Mexico, that some of these black panthers could actually be jaguars. Now, if we look at the UK is kind of an even more surprising case because the UK doesn't have any native cat species larger than a house cat. So that's the only cat that's supposed to be there is house cats. So what are the sightings there? So I'm going to show you, here's a couple pictures on the right of documented, photographic evidence of large cats that appear to be larger than house cats. I'm going to show you a couple of videos. I think this top video is pretty convincing once you see it, that this looks much larger than a house cat, and kind of the way the body moves and the way the tail comes out, it reminds me a lot more of like a lion or a tiger. And then this was a large black cat filmed overhead by a helicopter from a British police officer in 2009. Show you this video. So a large cat walking by some railroad tracks. So there's pretty good evidence, I think, that a lot of these cats are much larger than a house cat. There's something else. And to understand what's going on in the UK, we have to go a little bit into history. So in the 1800s and 1900s, a lot of wealthy people in England, one of the things they did with their money is they kept exotic animals as pets, not just as pets, but also as kind of guards. So if someone knew that a house's land was roaming with cheetahs and lions and so forth, maybe people would be less likely to go there to try and cause trouble or steal something. And it was also a sign of their incredible wealth that they could afford all these exotic pets imported from elsewhere. So just to show you a couple of examples, this is from an estate in England in 1805 that had a boxing kangaroo as a pet and also a little captive monkey you can see in the corner. And on the right, this is Lady Castlereagh. She had a pet lion in 1827. She also had ostriches, emus, as well as a pet jaguar. So it's pretty common for rich people up through into the 1900s to have a lot of exotic pets like this. But that all changed in 1976. So pretty recently, in 1976, the UK enacted a new law called the Dangerous Wild Animals Act, which prohibited people from keeping dangerous exotic animals as pets, including wild cats. So all of a sudden, it was illegal. They could be in trouble for doing this. And unfortunately, a lot of these rich people didn't just go through the normal channels of trying to give their pets away and make sure they had a good home. They just released them into the wild. So they had these exotic pets, they just let them go, and they'd often go on to threaten people and livestock. And we know this is true because a lot of these pets have been caught and killed. So this was a mountain lion. Mountain lion is not found in Scotland normally, captured in Scotland in 1980. This was a lynx shot by a farmer in England in 1991. And over here on the right, that was a leopard that ended up killing a lot of sheep in Scotland in 2001. So we know that these large cats do exist in the UK. So I'm going to rate this kind of cryptid category on a scale from 1 to 10. This is my scale of cryptid realness. For alien big cats, I'm rating this pretty high, a 9 out of 10. I do think some big cat sightings are probably misidentification, but we know that people have encountered exotic pets or zoo animals that have escaped, that can actually happen. Some of the sightings in the United States, I think, are jaguars, including black jaguars. And we kind of know that this happens in the UK, that these sightings are likely to be released wild cats from people's collections. But there are some big questions still. Is there actually a breeding population of big cats in the UK? In the future, will we have a new kind of native population of jaguars or lions or lynxes within the UK from these escaped exotic animals? Will jaguars successfully establish themselves in the US? Will we eventually have jaguars seen in California, for example? Right now, we don't yet have answers to these questions. So it's still an interesting cryptid group to look at. Here are some other examples of animals found in the wrong place. So in the last couple of decades, several fishermen have caught piranha, which are normally fish just found in the Amazon River, in several states, including Arkansas. This one was in Texas, as well as this one was in Louisiana. These were all pretty recently caught. They're in these lakes and rivers because they were pets, and then when they got big and scary, people would release them into the water. And we're not sure right now if they will actually establish themselves. They are kind of sensitive to water temperature, so it might be that they won't be able to endure in lakes, but it's possible they could find an American lake that's warmer and can actually support a piranha population. So again, that would be interesting if eventually we have our own kind of American piranha. Like I showed before, the idea of alligators living in sewers is mostly thought of as an urban legend. But does it? Oh,
exactly. You want me to get sick?
Okay.
No.
But does it ever actually happen?
I don't want to get sick.
Just
I get sick. Huh? I don't want to get sick.
okay. So if you go back a little bit, in 1935, according to newspapers, 2 teenagers spotted an alligator coming out of a sewer in New York. And more recently, this has happened quite a bit in the South, which is where alligators live. They live in southern marshlands from Texas to North Carolina, and sometimes they are found in sewers there. They get lost, they get turned around, and they end up in sewers. So for example, on the right, you can see this is a dead alligator that was pulled out of a Florida sewer in 2016. And I like this one on the left. This was an alligator in a Mississippi sewer where they actually sent a camera down into the sewer to check out the alligators. You can take a look at what they captured. It kind of bites at the camera cord, which is kind of fun. Yeah, so that can actually happen sometimes in the South, but it's unlikely. There's a lot of alligators in other sewers throughout the country. There's a couple of invasion stories, though, that have been all too real. So for example, Burmese pythons, very large non-venomous snakes native to Southeast Asia, were brought to the United States as pets And sometimes, again, if they got really big and too hard to handle, people would just release them. But it turned out that the Everglades in Florida was a really good conditions for these pythons. So they found a successful life there. They went from a few pets that were released and reproduced and were successful and now grew to about 300,000 pythons in the Everglades. And they can be very, very large, like this 215-pound snake. Or on the right here, this is a Burmese python in the process of eating an alligator. So they have had a pretty big, mostly negative impact on a lot of the native animals of the Everglades, but they've kind of have been very successful there. Here's another kind of fun example that maybe you know of. In Colombia, there was a drug lord, Pablo Escobar, and he kind of like the British wealthy people from the past, he liked to have exotic pets. So he kept hippos at his estate. But after he died in 1993, the hippos got out, and they eventually found their way to the nearby Magdalena River. And this population, again, was successful. It grew from just 4 original hippos to now about 130 hippos. You can kind of see this is like their distribution along the river right now. The government kind of doesn't know what to do with them. I think last I read, they're planning to go and kind of use some kind of birth control to sterilize some of the hippos so that they can't just keep growing. Hippos are endangered, so part of me kind of feels like it might be beneficial for hippos if you did have another clump somewhere in the world where they survive, but I just kind of feel bad for them as well. Like some of the people there actually really like them. So cryptozoologists aren't just interested in species found out of place. They're also interested in species that are giant, that are much larger than they would normally be. So for example, Christopher Columbus, which I'll talk about next week because he also saw mermaids a couple of times in his travels, supposedly, while he was traveling from like the 1880s, no, 1980s, in his time period, he came across some really big sea turtles on the order of 20 to 40 feet in length. There were other fishermen that also saw really large turtles like this spanning from the 1880s all the way to the 1950s. Living sea turtles are only known to measure up to 6 feet in length. So finding a 20 or 40 foot long sea turtle kind of seems crazy. Like we're not sure exactly what type of creature that would be. Let's also talk a little bit about anacondas. There's a lot of kind of interesting new developments about this as well. The largest verified anacondas on record are about 26 feet long, although even that is debated. Some scientists think that they can't be any longer than 20 feet, although there are some records of them being up to 26 feet long. But here, for example, is a 17-foot anaconda. But there are stories of much larger anacondas out there. So for example, an expedition in the Amazon in 1944 supposedly found an anaconda 38 feet long. You can see in this picture here, this is from an explorer in 1906 that supposedly encountered a 62-foot long anaconda. And there are records from a fort in Brazil in the past that killed an anaconda that was supposedly almost 150 feet long. So there are stories of much, much larger snakes out there. And this happened a few years ago that was pretty cool. In 2016, construction workers in Para, Brazil, supposedly encountered a giant anaconda after blowing up a cave. It appears to be that after they blew up the cave, this killed the anaconda in the process. Unfortunately, the snake wasn't examined by experts, but supposedly they measured the anaconda to be 33 feet long and it weighed 900 pounds. So here's a picture of this anaconda being held up by this vehicle. And they also got this video at the time. So I'm just going to show it to you. It's hard to judge exactly how big the snake is from the video, but this was video taken at the time of this dead anaconda. So it's hard to tell, but it could be a larger anaconda than has been documented by scientists. So if this is accurate, this is truly a giant anaconda similar to what has been documented in the past by explorers. Let's also talk a little bit about pigs. So wild boars are not native to the United States. They were brought here by European settlers, but over time they established themselves in populations throughout the southern United States, on kind of the southeast, but also in the southwest, including in California. Domestic pigs can be really, really huge compared to wild boars. The largest domestic pig on record is Big Bill. This is Big Bill after he died and was stuffed. In 1933, he weighed over a ton, 2,552 pounds. Wild boar tend to be much lighter because they're not just bred to be giant, chubby, meat machines. They're made to run around through the forest and get food and escape predators. So wild boars are usually just tend to be a few hundred pounds, 200 to 800 pounds. 800 pounds is pushing it as far as wild boars go. But periodically, hunters will claim that they've killed a giant wild hog. So for example, this pig here shown in this picture was nicknamed Monster Pig in Alabama. And supposedly he was a 1,000-pound wild pig, wild boar, but it turned out to be a much smaller domestic pig, and the photo was doctored. It kind of used point of view to make perspective to make it look like it was a giant pig when actually it was just a normal-sized domestic pig. Hogzilla from Georgia, on the other hand, was supposedly over 1,000 pounds. There's a picture of Hogzilla on the right. Again, this pig was thought to be a hoax, like Monster Pig, but it turned out that it wasn't actually a hoax. It was a really large pig, not 1,000 pounds, but 800 pounds. And what was really interesting is it wasn't really just a wild hog. It was a hybrid. It had genes from wild boar, but also from domesticated pigs. Because sometimes domesticated pigs get out and they can interbreed with wild boars and create hybrids. And because domesticated pigs have these genes for being really huge, you can end up with hybrid pigs that are much larger than normal wild boar. Here's another giant animal, the giant Pacific octopus, which is thought to be the largest octopus in the world. It's pretty big. It weighs as much as 157 pounds and can have a length of 11 feet. So here's an example of kind of a medium giant Pacific octopus. But there are sightings of much larger octopi. I think a lot of these sightings are probably from people that actually just saw a giant or colossal squid, which are animals we know of that are enormous. They can be up to 50 feet long. And if they saw that, they might not be able to differentiate between a giant squid and a giant octopus. So that probably explains quite a lot of the sightings. In the Bahamas, there are stories of aggressive underwater cave-dwelling octopi called lusca, and they can supposedly be over 100 feet long. According to folklore, they live in these really deep kind of underwater caves called blue holes. That's where the lusca lives. So if you go in there, you could get attacked, supposedly. So I'm going to give these guys a rating according to my subjective scale. Giant anacondas, I'm rating pretty high, 7 out of 10. It's possible that giant anacondas exist. That video and the documentation from the construction crew seem to show a really large anaconda, but we're waiting for more definite proof. Giant pigs, I think, is pretty good, 8 out of 10. We've already found some huge hogs in the US, and like the example I showed before, if you have a hybrid that has genes of domesticated pigs and wild boars, that could lead to a really enormous pig. Giant octopi, I don't think is likely. I'm rating it 2 out of 10. I think a lot of the sightings and stories, if they are from actual observations, probably were just people who saw giant squids or colossal squids and thought they were an octopus. Okay. So now let's move on to another category of cryptids, which is animals not quite dead. Again, although charismatic and unusual creatures like Bigfoot, Chupacabra, and Nessie get most of the attention from the general public, cryptozoologists are equally interested in whether recently dead species are actually dead or if they're still out there somewhere. So for example, the thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger, is one of the most popular cryptozoological creatures in the world. So let's talk a little bit about the thylacine. Although the thylacine is called the Tasmanian tiger, sometimes it's called the Tasmanian wolf because it does look a lot like a dog with stripes. It's not a tiger, it's a marsupial. It used to be the largest marsupial predator while it was alive. And it wasn't just in Tasmania. In the past, it existed on mainland Australia as well. Climate change and possibly the introduction of the dingo by Aborigines that came to Australia several tens of thousands of years ago led to its extinction on the mainland about 20,000 years ago. So then it was just confined to Tasmania. And thylacine survived in Tasmania up until the 1930s. So this was their range prior to European arrival. But when Europeans settled into Tasmania, they started a campaign of basically trying to drive thylacine to extinction. Like you can see this picture here of someone killed a thylacine because they thought they were a major predator of their livestock. And I guess in all likelihood, they were successful in either killing completely off this species or driving them almost to extinction. This is the last known living thylacine in the middle here, who lived at a zoo. This is a video from 1933. You can see what they look like. So again, this is a marsupial, closely related to like kangaroos or koalas. But you can see this is an example of what biologists call convergent evolution, like how much this animal has been shaped by selection to look and kind of act and behave and walk a lot like a dog. You can see later on, he's kind of eating some meat and using one paw to hold it down and kind of tearing it off with their teeth, which I think is very much what a dog would do. So a pretty impressive case of convergent evolution. So that's a real thylacine. So kind of keep that in your head as we look at some possible new sightings of thylacines. So again, the last documented case of a living thylacine is from the 1930s. But since then, there's been a consistent sightings of Tasmanian tigers, not just in Tasmania, but also in mainland Australia as well. So this is just kind of showing some dots of thylacine sightings in Tasmania from 1936 to 1980. And you can see that it kind of does match the previous distribution, that there didn't used to be a lot of thylacine this bottom part of the island, and that's actually where you don't see a lot of sightings. And this is showing these dots are sightings of thylacine in Australia itself. One sad thing that's happened, though, is that the number of sightings of thylacine has actually gone down over time. So we used to have a lot more, particularly in the 60s and 70s, but more recently, there's a lot fewer sightings, especially in Tasmania itself. And I'm going to show you a scientific paper later. So this was a peer-reviewed paper that looked at these sightings and said, based on the available evidence, it appears that these thylacines actually did survive, but because the sightings have gone down, that's evidence that they just recently went actually really extinct around the 1990s. So that was a peer-reviewed scientific paper that basically said that the scientific community up until the 1990s was wrong to consider these guys definitely extinct. And maybe if they had taken this seriously and sought to find and protect them, maybe they wouldn't have gone extinct if that paper is accurate. But despite widespread sightings, again, a body has never been recovered. So we don't have conclusive physical evidence. Here are some possible evidence, and I just want to show you again, this is a stuffed real thylacine in comparison. This is a famous photograph, which is not, people are not sure exactly what it is, but some people propose is a thylacine because of the striping, and you can see a straight tail. But again, it's kind of hard to tell exactly the shape of the animal from this picture. I want to show you a couple videos. On the lower left, this is a video of a thylacine sighting in South Australia. So again, not in Tasmania, in Australia in 2016. But you can also see the interview with this cryptozoological group there, the Thylacine Awareness Group, that does investigations into sightings of the thylacine. So let's take a look at this footage.
Benjamin passed away And we thought, what better a day than National Threatened Species Day to make available for everyone to view and to judge our video of what we believe is a thylacine roaming the Adelaide Hills in South Australia. So what we're seeing here is some footage that was obtained by a lad in February this year. First couple of screens that come through, you can see the animal's head. It looks towards the camera, then it turns away and just keeps going about its business. In the next few frames, you can see the body of the animal. It does appear to have some sort of dark discoloration on the body, which may or may not be stripes. The last couple of frames of the footage, you can clearly see it has a very distinct hop on its rear foot. It has a long, stiff, pointy tail. Where the tail connects to the body is very wide at the base, which is typical of the thylacine. We believe our footage to be footage of a small thylacine moving.
Okay, so there was a little clip I want to show you. This is another sighting from 2008, so you can see what this potential thylacine looked like. Whoops, get back here. Okay, so showed you a couple of video clips. You can kind of judge for yourself what you think. What are some other explanations for these sightings if it's not a thylacine? Well, I think that probably most of the sightings are this. Maybe not all of them, but I think this is probably the most common misidentification. So red foxes and dingoes do live in Australia. I don't think either one is in Tasmania, but they might have some kind of fox there, I think. But I think this is likely to be the primary candidate for misidentification, especially if they're afflicted with mange. So if they have mange that causes extreme hair loss, so this is the dingo with mange, here's a red fox with mange. You can see if they have this hair loss, then all of a sudden, instead of a bushy tail, they have a straight hairless tail, which would match the look of the thylacine tail. So I think that likely, and also if they have hair loss that kind of gives them like a striping appearance because they could lose some coloration in patches, I think this likely explains at least some of the sightings of the thylacine. But my score is still pretty high, 7.5 out of 10. There have been hundreds of sightings of thylacine in Australia and Tasmania. Many are probably misidentification, but what about if it actually is a striped animal? Dingoes and foxes are not striped. If thylacine do still exist, where's the evidence? I think if they do exist, and right now it seems likely that if they do exist, it's a pocket actually in Australia rather than Tasmania. It might have a very small population. There might just be a few thylacine out there. And some animals can be extremely elusive and difficult to find, even if they're real. So these are little sand cats, which are very cute. But recently they went through a decade where no one saw sand cats. People tried, they tried to photograph them. No one saw them, no one took videos of them. And then after the 10 years were up, someone saw them again. So some animals are just very elusive. They're hard to photograph, they're hard to find. And a lot of Tasmania is still relatively unexplored wildland. There's still a lot of forest here. So you could still have a pocket of maybe just a dozen or a couple dozen individuals of thylacine. I think that's not unreasonable. Okay. And it may not matter because there are efforts right now by scientists to actually clone thylacine. They have DNA of them, so it might be that in the future we'll just have a population of thylacine in Tasmania and Australia. You know, that maybe if there are some wild populations, they'll just interbreed and we won't even know if they actually existed or not. So it may not actually matter going forward. Here's another example of a possibly extinct animal that gets a lot of attention from cryptozoologists. The American ivory-billed woodpecker. The last well-documented sighting was from 1944. Since then, it's been presumed extinct. This is what it looks like here. However, people have claimed to spot the bird since then. And in this case, scientists have actually kind of done What I'd like them to do, they've actually taken part in this search based on sightings, based on listening to where people supposedly have seen them. This was a journal published in Ecology and Evolution that set out camera traps all over the place, and they included with this article their own video footage, which they think shows this woodpecker. And I'll show you this little clip where you can see what they think is the woodpecker kind of flying to a tree. But you can see the striping pattern that's consistent with the woodpecker as we know it. I kind of show it in slow motion. So you can see the black and white stripes associated with it. So they think that the characteristics in their video show this is likely to be this ivory-billed woodpecker. Cryptozoologists are also interested in species kind of like extinct way further into the past, like the stellar sea cow, which was a really big cousin to existing manatees, the dodo, which went extinct in 1693, and then the moa, giant land bird, which went extinct in 1445. There are accounts of people encountering each of these species. So there are stories of people finding dodos or coming across a stellar sea cow. And it's not crazy that a big animal could exist, especially if it's relatively rare. Like this, for example, is a giant Galapagos tortoise. This species was thought to be extinct in the Galapagos in 1906 and then was rediscovered alive in 2019. So went through more than 100 years of scientists believing this species was extinct. Okay, so let's take a little 10-minute break. During this time, I have my cryptozoology library that I brought. So those of you who are in here, if you want to take a look at it, I also have some sign-in sheets to sign in for faculty as well as for students. If you're in the Zoom chat, remember to, if you're a student, please write down your name and the name of your instructor if you're trying to get credit for attending. But let's just take a little 10-minute break. So before the break, we talked about extinct species that were hidden for maybe a few hundred years, like if we're talking about like the dodo or something. But could a species remain hidden for millions of years? So that's kind of our next category, ancient cryptids, ancient monsters. Well, it is possible. A lot of you probably know this story, but until 1938, we believed that this whole group of lobe-finned fishes as a category died off 66 million years ago at the end of the Cretaceous. But that year, in 1938, a fisherman caught a lobe-finned fish. And this was the coelacanth. So since that time, we didn't just have one species, we actually discovered another coelacanth species. So now there's two living species of coelacanths, thought to be extinct from the fossil record for 66 million years. These are called Lazarus taxa, species which were presumed long extinct until we just found one of them someday that was alive. Here are some pretty extreme examples. So we have this ant. So this type of ant had disappeared for the fossil record and thought was extinct for 20 million years. This is a rock rat. This group was thought to be extinct for 11 million years. This group of fly was thought to be extinct for 100 million years. Here's a little tiny lobster. Their group was thought to be extinct for 34 million years. And then this nightcap oak, that plant group was thought to be extinct for 20 million years. So these are all pretty extreme examples of we didn't have any fossil evidence. We thought this group was dead. We didn't find it. And then all of a sudden, we found living examples of them. A lot of the Lazarus species of interest to cryptozoologists are big ones, which, yes, are less likely to be true, but that's kind of what makes them interesting, like dinosaurs or giant prehistoric mammals that could possibly still be alive. The most famous of these types of creatures is probably Nessie, the lake monster of Loch Ness, Scotland, which is usually imagined to be a plesiosaur. Other famous lake monsters include Champ of Lake Champlain, kind of looks a lot like Nessie, Ogopogo from Okanagan Lake in Canada. And you might not know this, but even Palmdale used to be the site of a lake monster. If you go back in history, the Lake Elizabeth used to have a monster that lived there, seen in the 1800s. Now Lake Elizabeth has like shriveled up a lot, And if there was a monster there, it's probably dead. But at least in the 1800s, supposedly there was a monster that lived right here in our neck of the woods. Some of the most famous cryptozoological photographs are those of Nessie. So these are all pretty famous photographs. This is probably the most famous one back from 1934. Unfortunately, most of these have turned out to be hoaxes, where the people who photographed them later admitted it was a hoax, including, unfortunately, this famous photograph. These are some other older ones which were shown to be hoaxes. I don't know when this one was taken, but it's kind of a crappy looking one that was a hoax. However, here are some photos that were never determined to be fakes. The people who took them never said they were fakes. They said that they were just taking pictures of something. So they appear to be taking pictures of something in the water by honest people, including this interesting picture from 1933, 1955, and then this is a chant photograph from 1977. And there's some recent evidence. So these pictures, I think, are pretty interesting. They almost look like really thick, almost like islands or something. So this is from Loch Ness 2020. This is Lake Ogopogo from 2018. And then this one was pretty cool. This was from Iceland back in 2012 of a kind of an ice river worm monster. And the video is kind of weird. Like scientists have tried to kind of explain that this could be something that's not even alive, just kind of something floating through the water. But I'll show you. It is kind of a cool looking video. But this is like this giant river worm is part of the traditional folklore of Iceland. And the government of Iceland actually came out and said, yes, this is actually the river worm. So they authenticated it at least. But it's an interesting video if you look into it. So if we explain, well, what are these lake monsters? Could they actually be living plesiosaurs? Well, according to the fossil record, kind of the same situation we had with the coelacanths, plesiosaurs went extinct 66 million years ago. They were ancestral reptiles, and like reptiles today, they had lungs. They didn't have gills. So if they were plesiosaurs, they would have to come up to the surface frequently to breathe. So every so often you'd see a head sticking out of the water. And I think given how much attention there is, particularly on Loch Ness, this makes it pretty unlikely that the Loch Ness monster is actually a population of plesiosaurs. I think the amount of surfacing they would have to do would mean that there would be way better evidence than what actually exists. So I don't think this explanation is likely. Some cryptozoologists have suggested that lake monsters are actually unknown large species of whales. And both Loch Ness and Lake Champlain are connected to the ocean via rivers. So in theory, lake monsters could be ocean monsters like whales that lost their way and ended up in these lakes. And then they kind of set up and maybe evolved a little bit there within the lakes. You can see here's Lake Champlain, eventually connects to the ocean up here, and then Loch Ness is also connected to the ocean. And there's actually some evidence of this whale hypothesis. So people have recorded audio from under the water in Lake Champlain, and they've recorded what appears to be kind of click sounds that are very similar to beluga whale calls. So here's one of these recordings from 2016. So it has a very similar structure to like the echolocation clicks of a beluga whale. And this is not so crazy. Beluga whales are known to breed in the river that connects to Lake Champlain by a short connecting river. So this is a map showing the summer distribution of beluga whales and their total distribution. So in the summer, they're hanging out really way up into the river. So it's not crazy at all that some beluga whales could lose their way, go down this little offshoot, and end up in Lake Champlain. So what about the Loch Ness monster? Well, Loch Ness is known to be home to seals and otters, which often swim together, and they could give the impression of multiple humps. So here are some European otters in Loch Ness. You could imagine if it was kind of dark and they're swimming and kind of all together, that it could give the appearance of some creature with multiple humps. as I think happened here. This was taken as a Nessie photo from 2016, but if you look at it really carefully, this appears to be the head of a seal. And this is another seal that's just kind of diving. And here's another seal diving. You can see the end of their tail there. So this appears to be just 3 seals swimming together, which gives the impression of a multi-humped lake monster. Another interesting idea is dolphins. Now, dolphins are not known to live in Loch Ness, but again, Loch Ness is connected to the ocean, so it wouldn't be crazy. Like there are river dolphins. Dolphins do sometimes end up going into rivers, and whales do that as well. And I think some of these photos of Nessie are really similar to the dorsal fin of a dolphin or like a toothed whale. So this is a photo from the 1930s of Nessie. And I think if you, people might have perceived this as a neck, but if you think of this as a dorsal fin, this looks really so similar to the dorsal fin of a dolphin. And again, here's another Nessie photo from 2016 of Loch Ness. But again, I think this looks a lot like a dorsal fin of a cetacean, which would still be a really cool thing. Like, we don't know that there's dolphins and whales in Loch Ness, but maybe there are. Maybe that could be the explanation behind these lake monsters. Sightings of lake monsters in general could also be large lake fish, like sturgeons and gars. Here's a white sturgeon here. They can get really big, up to 20 feet in length. You can imagine if this guy was kind of on the surface of the water, it would have a really similar look to a lake monster. Same thing here with this alligator gar, which can get very large. On the subject of water monsters, let's take a little bit of a departure to sea monsters, specifically massive sea serpents populating the ocean. So here are some drawings, like medieval drawings of sea serpents that people thought kind of, were in the oceans and could sometimes attack ships, like you're kind of seeing here on the bottom. In China, there's also a lot of mythology around dragons, which live in water bodies and control the weather and are kind of like deities within their belief system. And here's a typical look of a Chinese dragon, which again, usually lives within water bodies. I think the sea serpent in almost every case was probably based on a real fish, the longest fish in the world, a giant oarfish, which can grow up to 36 feet long. You can see how big they can get. And I think if you didn't know that this fish existed and you saw it, you could very well just imagine it's a sea serpent. Like, I think this fish is basically a sea serpent. Like, it really looks like kind of like the past reconstructions of them. Here's a video of one, some oarfish swimming at the surface from 2023. So you can imagine if you were in a boat and you saw this swimming next to you and you didn't know what it was, why wouldn't you think of it as just a giant sea serpent? Like dozens of feet long, this giant animal. So I think that's responsible for a lot of the sea serpent folklore, is this guy. And I've actually, this is kind of my own observation, but if you look at kind of the specific characteristics of an oarfish, they have these ornamental kind of modified dorsal fins that stick out. And they also have these pelvic fins that kind of stick out on the sides that are very long and thin. To me, this looks a lot like the horns and whiskers of a Chinese dragon. And again, you would have kind of like spiky little points going down the back, just like the same as an oarfish. So I think that the Chinese dragon was really inspired by people just very rarely laying their eyes on an oarfish, which don't come to the surface very often at all. So it'd be this really rare thing that they would see one. And I think this kind of turned into this over time. A lot of famous sea monsters are not known from observations of them when they're alive. They're from carcasses. So some weird blob creature comes up, washes up on the shore. People don't know what it is, and then they call it like a monster. So a lot of sea monsters were like this. So this is called the St. Augustine monster from 1896. Sometimes they have fun names, like this is the 4-mile lobster from 1997. Not quite as creative, the gross white mass from 2007. But I think a lot of these are just bloated, decaying whale carcasses or shark carcasses. That, once it's kind of decaying and broken down, it doesn't usually look like itself. Like this is an actual whale carcass that's been bloated due to the production of gases by bacterial decomposition inside the body. But this doesn't really look like a whale anymore. So I think a lot of these are just a normal animal in the process of decomposing. Another kind of ancient animal that's gotten a lot of attention is from the Congo. There are stories of a giant beast called Mokele Mbembe, which means one who stops the flow of rivers. The giant beast is said to be 30 feet long. It spends most of its time in the water, and it's said to be so dangerous it could kill an elephant. So it's this really dangerous, huge animal. In the past, when naturalists, when explorers showed pictures of different animals to indigenous people in this area of the Congo, and they said, which of these is the Mokele Mbembe? A lot of times they would point to sauropods, drawings of sauropods, to say, that's what it looks like. So that became an idea that maybe Mokele Mbembe is a sauropod that has survived all the way to the present. A lot of expeditions have gone out, kind of like every few years there's a new expedition. So since 1938, a lot of expeditions have gone out, but none have found solid evidence of its existence, which seems like kind of a bad sign if you're looking for a really massive animal, that you should be able to find better evidence than this. Another African beast that's really interesting is called Kongamato, which means breaker of boats. And it's said to be a giant flying swamp creature that sometimes attacks fishermen. And in 1957, there's documentation that a Zambian man got to a hospital with a really serious chest wound that he said was given to him by a Kongamato, a giant flying creature. And when he drew a picture of what it looked a lot like a pterosaur. So for some cryptozoologist enthusiasts, they think this is a living pterosaur that has survived to the current day. Other cryptozoologists believe that it's more likely to be a giant unknown bat species. There are giant bats in Africa. They're not, aggressive and don't usually attack people, but it could be a new species that is more aggressive than a usual large bat. Or it could be misidentifying a large bird, like some people think that the description really matches this stork, which is found there. But again, this stork is not known to be really aggressive and attack people and cause serious injuries. So it's a little bit still of a mystery. So for Nessie and Champ, despite their popularity, I rate them pretty low, 3 out of 10. I really don't think that they're living plesiosaurs, although that would be really cool if they were. I would be very happy if they were, but I don't think so. They're probably either known animals like lost cetaceans, like dolphins and whales that lost their way, which is still really cool, which is still something. Or maybe even a new species of lake-adapted whale or dolphin that's lived there for a while, which would still be a really cool discovery. Mokele Mbembe, again, pretty low. I think it would be difficult for sauropods to hide for so long, even in a dense rainforest that you find in the Congo. But one interesting idea from this is that some cryptozoologists have said maybe what this folklore represents is that people have had experiences with a large mammal in the past, which is now extinct. Africa, just like North America, just like Australia, had massive mammals that are no longer alive. So maybe this is remembering experiences with a species from the past that's no longer alive, which I think is at least possible. Kongamato, I think, is a little bit more likely. Stories about this beast are found throughout several African countries. I didn't mention this, but there's also stories of these, they also call them giant death birds that supposedly live in caves and which attack people, which could again be some kind of giant bat that's way more aggressive than what we know of for African bats. So it could be a large aggressive bat or possibly some really aggressive bird that we don't really know very well. But I don't think it's likely to be a pterosaur. So far we've covered cryptids that are at least match pretty well something we know from the fossil record. But now let's look at kind of weird, plausible creatures. So we can identify them as belonging to a known biological group, but maybe they're not exactly a species from the past. A lot of cryptozoology deals with unknown ape species, so let's take a little survey through ape cryptids. North America is home to a couple of ape cryptids. There's the skunk ape, which is usually stinky, a hairy bipedal ape that lives in kind of the swamps of Florida and other southern states. Oftentimes it's a little reddish looking, like in this drawing here. The more common cryptid is Bigfoot or Sasquatch, which is supposed to be very tall, 7 to 9 foot bipedal ape with large feet and a muscular, hairy body. They're mostly found, most of the sightings, most of the folklore comes from the Pacific Northwest. Bigfoot sightings are extremely common throughout the United States. In the last 100 years alone, there's been more than 3,000 recorded sightings. So this is a map of these sightings. You can see a lot of them in the Northwest. Probably a lot of these are actually skunk ape, and then this could also be Sasquatch up here. There's also more regional versions of this as well. There's not just those two. You can see there's also some in California. Evidence for Bigfoot mostly takes the form of media and footprints. The most famous Bigfoot film is called the Patterson film of 1967. And I had to actually pay for this, but this is the raw footage of the Patterson film. You can't just get this for free. So this is from 1967. This is the full footage taken of this supposed Bigfoot. Well, there have been claims that this was a hoax, but it's never actually been proven to be the hoax. The people that were involved kind of a lot of them went to their graves just saying this is what really happened. This was from Humboldt, California. That's where it was shot. And along with the film, they also made several footprint molds. So these are some of the casts taken from this area where the sighting occurred. So really big feet. Over the years, more photographic evidence has been collected, as well as hundreds of Sasquatch footprint casts. So here's supposedly a Sasquatch juvenile from Pennsylvania, kind of from the back here, 2007. This is probably the most famous photograph of the skunk ape from Florida in 2000. I actually have some replicas of footprints. So this is, I don't know if you can see super well, but this is just a replica of a human footprint, kind of like maybe like a child-sized footprint, kind of like showing what a human footprint looks like. And this is a replica of a cast that the cryptozoologist Lauren Coleman took in Decatur, Illinois in 1962. So if you want to, when the talk's over, you can come take a look at it. I could have ordered other footprints, but I kind of like this one because of the orientation of the toes. And I'll kind of show this to the camera as well. And I just collected these pictures of typical footprints of different apes. You can see how the human foot is. The toes are all kind of arranged in a line, which is really good for bipedal locomotion. But if you're going to be grabbing branches with your toes, it's nice to have this big toe out here so you can grab branches between it. So that's what you find in chimpanzees, orangutans, and gorillas, which are much better climbers than we are. And actually, if I think the closest one that matches the footprint I have is maybe this gorilla footprint, where you can see the thumb kind of sticking out, kind of in a similar way to the gorilla. So that's kind of interesting because this is not typical of most Bigfoot prints, which again is like, well, if this was a hoax, why would you make something like this atypically? There was a recent study which was actually rejected by scientific journals funded by the millionaire Adrian Erickson that supposedly found DNA samples from hair and skin samples. Like this was a skin sample used for this project called the Sasquatch Genome Project that supposedly revealed unknown hominid genetic sequences. There are some suspicious stuff about this project paid for by this millionaire. They also supposedly captured some actual Sasquatches And this is a photograph of one of these called Matilda. To me, this looks pretty fake, kind of like Chewbacca or something. So I'm not super convinced by this particular evidence. I do like this video, though. This is a video I found of a Sasquatch or a skunk ape in kind of a swampy area from 2013. But what's really kind of interesting about this that you'll see is that whatever this creature is, it's kind of pulling bark off of a tree and kind of dropping it into the water, which seems like kind of a weird thing that you would do if you were making this as a hoax. Like, why would you have this creature pulling bark off, kind of looking for grubs or something to eat? So you can take a look at this video. Kind of like standing in the water too, which just seems like kind of a weird production to go through. So I kind of like that video. If we go into the Yeti or the abominable snowman, this is again a large hairy bipedal ape that supposedly lives in the cold Himalayan mountains. Usually it's kind of thought of as kind of having a pointy head like this. This is a footprint photograph taken from 1951, one of the first documented evidence of the Yeti. Sometimes the Yeti is depicted as a large hairy man, but other times the Yeti is depicted as a large bear, just some unknown species of bear. And actually, scientists have kind of done a lot where they've collected supposed Yeti fur, because a lot of times in temples and other areas, they'll actually have supposed Yeti scalps that have fur on it. So scientists have taken some of those samples and put them through DNA analysis. One team did this with this Yeti fur in 2014, and their analysis was disputed by other teams of scientists, but the original team kind of stuck behind their initial results, and they've kind of published back against it. But supposedly, the DNA matched an unknown cousin of polar bears. So an unknown species of bear that's different from the bears that naturally occur in that region. So it would be interesting if this was actually a rare, but kind of a new species of bear occupying the Himalayas. Another possibility, less likely, is that the Yeti is a remnant population of Gigantopithecus, an enormous orangutan cousin that lived in Asia up until 100,000 years ago. Really big guy, so much bigger than a human. These are comparative skulls. You can see human skull, gorilla skull, and then a pretty big Gigantopithecus skull. I don't think I have this on here, but one interesting point, I always thought that this inspired King Kong, but King Kong was actually made right before this Gigantopithecus was discovered. So it's a little bit like they were kind of telling the future that, like, oh, you'll find evidence of this giant ape. So the movie came out before we actually knew that giant apes existed in the fossil record, which is kind of cool. This is maybe my favorite of the cryptids, the ape cryptids. In Sumatra, an island of Indonesia, there's stories of another ape cryptid, the orang pendek, which means short person. So these are kind of some drawings based on descriptions, a very short, slightly hairy, herbivorous bipedal ape, often thought of as kind of reddish tinged in the fur, so much smaller than a person. This species is well known to the native people of Indonesia, and it's also been seen by Dutch settlers, scientists, explorers, military people. All kinds of people have had sightings of orang pendek. And this one's really interesting. Footprints and hair samples have been collected and sent to teams of experts, and their conclusion was that this did actually belong to an unknown species of primate. So there's indirect evidence that there is some kind of new primate species that's living on this island. And this is a footprint cast of what the orang pendek's foot supposedly looks like. So what could this be? There is a Sumatran orangutan, but it doesn't actually live there in the region where orang pendek lives. And physical descriptions are pretty different. It's not bipedal, for one thing. Orang pendek could be a new orangutan species, one that we don't know of, with shorter fur and using bipedal locomotion, which would be a pretty different type of orangutan. Another possibility, though, is Homo floresiensis, the hobbit people. This was another species within the genus Homo that lived in that region, lived in Indonesia up until at least 50,000 years ago. So it coincided with when people were there. So people would have encountered this other Homo species. Some cryptozoologists believe that this cousin of ours still exists and is in fact the orang pendek. So this is a skull of Homo floresiensis. This is a reconstruction of what they supposedly look like. Very small, slightly hairy, and this is a reconstruction of orang pendek. And to me, they do look really similar. To me, this is the most likely explanation, is that this is either folklore continuing on from when this species existed, or maybe there's still a pocket of hobbit people still alive on this island, which would be a really cool discovery if we weren't the only Homo species alive after all. So cryptozoologists and scientists have collected ape cryptid hair and feces for DNA sample analysis. Some of these have shown results for unknown bears or unknown species of primates. Some scientists have taken this seriously. So this was published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, looking at the hair from Yeti. This was another article from them. So scientists have done these tests. In most cases, they are known animals. In most cases, they're humans or known bears or deer or something like that. But there are some interesting results that point to possible unknown species. Other explanations for ape cryptid sightings could be hoaxes, bears, or escaped primates. So if you have a bear standing up in the dark, could look a little bit like a Bigfoot. There have been intentional hoaxes like this Minnesota Iceman hoax from 1970, which was a fake. Sometimes primates do escape from zoos or from private collections, like this chimp that was running around Missouri in 2020. So Bigfoot I rate as a 4 out of 10. There is a very large volume of sightings and footprints, which makes it unlikely that all of these are mistaken identification. It does seem unlikely that a large primate could hide from people for so long without giving better evidence. But if they're intelligent and really trying to avoid people, it's at least possible. Yeti, I think 6 out of 10. There's conflicted DNA evidence the Yeti could be an unknown or maybe hybrid species of bear, which would be cool if it's something, some unknown new species. Orang pendek, I think, is the best ape cryptid for actually existing, 9 out of 10. There's really convincing evidence in terms of who's seen the orang pendek, the accounts, the constant, like if you look at my cryptozoology journals, they have an article on the orang pendek. There's still interviews with indigenous people who've had experiences with orang pendek. I wouldn't be surprised at all if this turns out to be a new orangutan or possibly Homo floresiensis, a new another species within our own genus. So now let's take a look at thunderbirds. Besides primates, one of the most interesting plausible cryptids is the thunderbird. Thunderbirds are very large birds found in many different mythologies of North American tribes. They also, giant birds played a big role in Aztec and Mayan myths. So here are some kind of classic representations of thunderbirds, as well as this giant bird from Mayan mythology. One popular hypothesis for thunderbirds is they could be living members of the giant teratorn birds. So these were real birds, flying Goliaths that had wingspans up to 20 feet. So you can see how the biggest ones would look compared to a person. And they did live in North America until 10,000 years ago. So people coexisted with these giant birds for a long time. So at the very least, you could say that thunderbird mythology and folklore could very well have been based on these teratorn birds, even if they're no longer alive, which is still pretty cool that, you know, you have this prehistoric basis from these giant birds. But there have been sightings of thunderbirds throughout the US from the late 1800s until today. A lot of the recent sightings have occurred in Alaska, which does seem like a good place for a giant bird to hang out. There was a bunch of sightings in 2002, and then another cluster of sightings in Alaska, multiple people calling in for like 911 calls about giant birds in 2018. Supposedly, in Tombstone, Arizona, one of these giant birds was killed. It's a little bit ambiguous, but supposedly there might even be a photograph that looks like this, where they actually killed the bird and they showed how big it is compared to several people. But at least, that's the story, is that this happened in 1890. In Illinois, in 1977, according to the family, this boy was lifted off the ground by a thunderbird, and they managed to get the boy away from the thunderbird, so he was okay. But the parents called the police. They tried really hard to try and get this thunderbird caught and tracked, because it might attack someone else. And one of the news companies at the time hired a well-known Native American hunter, military person, and field photographer named Chief AJ. And he actually went out into Illinois and he captured this footage, supposedly of thunderbirds. So I want to play you some of the footage that he captured, because I think it's pretty interesting evidence. This is him talking over it, by the way.
May report giant living thunderbirds were pouring into newspaper offices and TV stations across central Illinois. I, Chief AJ of the Central Tribal Native American Council, was called upon by CBS television to try to film a living thunderbird. I've been trained by the United States Marine Corps to be a combat photographer. CBS had called on me many times in the past to film major fires. I have produced good films for CBS, delivering to them network quality results. I studied a map of central Illinois where the thunderbird sightings had been happening and decided to cruise by canoe the remote shoreline of Lake Shelbyville. I had my 16mm news camera loaded with 100 feet of professional Ektachrome film. You are now seeing the original footage of living flying thunderbirds straight out of Native American legend.
So I kind of like that footage. I think I've watched vultures flying a lot. I've watched ravens and crows flying a lot. I've seen California condors flying a lot. And to me, that looks much closer to something like a California condor. Like if you look at the proportions of the animal and how long it takes for them to swing their wing down and back up. I kind of talked about this last time, but I had some pushback. So what I actually did is I took various stills, like quite a few places in the video, and I measured the ratio of the wingspan to body length. And I did this quite a few times, and I kind of just did an average. So the range in the video is somewhere in the ballpark of 3 to 3.5. You could do this too. If you want me to send you the video, you could do your own analysis. But I think it's got a very long wingspan compared to the length of the animal, 3 to 3.5. Crows and ravens, it's pretty low, 1.8. Turkey vultures is a little bit higher. California condors is a little bit higher. And there are some, so this is showing you a vulture. This is a condor, their proportions. This is a very large eagle. They are higher, but they're still a little bit lower than what's actually visible in the video. The closest I think you get is in some very large species of eagles that have really big wingspans compared to their body length. Something that I've kind of been thinking about is if this actually happened, that this bird tried to attack and like lift up a child, that would be really unlikely. Like turkey vultures can't do that. They're not good at lifting. California condors also not good at lifting, but eagles can do that. And in fact, there are eagles, like some African eagles, that have been known to sometimes carry off children. Like they've done that before. So I think it seems pretty likely that this could be either an eagle from elsewhere that got lost and ended up in Illinois and then just attacked someone, or possibly an unknown species of eagle that lives in North America that's more aggressive. But I think that, to me, is the most likely explanation based on kind of what you can see in the video. So my score for Thunderbirds is pretty high. I do think it's pretty cool, just the idea that traditional folklore about Thunderbirds could originate from experiences that people actually had with Territorn birds. And if you believe this story that a child was actually lifted by a giant bird in Illinois, the most likely candidate is probably a large aggressive eagle or a existing Territorn bird. But I think that's probably less likely than just being like a big eagle that ended up migrating the wrong way, ended up in Illinois. There's also been these clusters of sightings recently in Alaska that suggest that there could be some unknown large bird species that continues to exist there. So we might end up with a discovery in the near future from Alaska. So far I focused on cryptids that seem biologically reasonable, but not all cryptids are like that. Some cryptids are hard to categorize as actual biological creatures, like this bat squat here from Washington, or this weird flying creature from Maryland called the snallygaster, or this weird creature that seems to be kind of a combination of a fungus and an animal from the Amazon. So one example of this is the Mothman. Mothman is a cryptid from West Virginia that dates back to 1966. Sometimes it's described as like a man, basically, with moth wings. It's also usually tied to having supernatural powers of appearing before a major disaster occurs. So this idea of that, oh, maybe the Mothman appeared on this bridge before the bridge collapsed, that kind of thing. And this is a really popular cryptid. So in Point Pleasant, they have a Mothman festival every year with Mothman-themed attractions, foods, and speakers. So if you wanted to go to a cryptid festival, that's pretty popular. Jersey Devil, which is now known as a mascot, but actually originated as supposedly a real creature, a real monster that lived in New Jersey. These are some of the original drawings of what the Jersey Devil looked like, kind of something like a horse with wings, type of a demon creature. Chupacabra is a really popular cryptid, and some people don't realize this, but it's also very recent. In fact, stories of chupacabras only began in 1995, starting in Puerto Rico, where a farm basically had a whole bunch of animals die and supposedly had their blood drained from their body. This is the aftermath of this supposed chupacabra attack. This creature has then become very popular and popped up throughout Latin America and the United States. So this is supposedly a photograph of the chupacabra, although reconstructions of it oftentimes are also bipedal and kind of reptilian as well. So yeah, this cryptid is hairless, a spiky creature that sucks the blood out of animals like goats, chickens, and sheep. The name actually means goat sucker, so that makes sense. A lot of photographs that supposedly show chupacabras, like these pictures here, were all taken to be representative of chupacabras. I'm pretty sure that these are just known animals that, again, came down with mange. This is a fox and a coyote showing what they look like with mange. So the evidence for chupacabras is not particularly convincing. Here are some more kind of weird cryptids. I can't cover all of them because there are, hundreds of cryptids out there. This one, I'm actually going to go into some detail in next week's talk. So if you want to learn more about this Mongolian death worm, there's a lot of interesting stuff about it. So but the rest of these, I don't think I'm going to cover. So I might need a part 3 or something. So the last question I'm going to cover is, but are cryptids real? So given all of this analysis, is there anything real about this? Like I mentioned before, in the past, explorers and naturalists felt that where there was smoke, there was fire. Where people said they saw things, where they had stories about creatures, that usually meant that there was something there, some unknown creature that kind of stimulated these stories. And people didn't always know what they were. So there would just be rumors of like well, there's some weird creature that kind of has a long nose and horns coming out. But these are medieval drawings of elephants from people that didn't see elephants, but they heard stories of elephants and they heard accounts of elephants, so they reconstructed them. Extensive sightings and indigenous folklore usually means that people are seeing something. They're either seeing a misidentified known species, maybe a rare giant specimen, an animal that got lost from somewhere, or in some cases, a genuine new species. These are all species that were only discovered in the last year. So we didn't know about any of these until this last year. So we are still discovering sometimes pretty big species. Like it wasn't that long ago that a new whale was discovered, that tapir was discovered. There was a new primate that was discovered not too long ago. So we still discover new species every year. From the beginning, scientists have been involved in cryptozoological investigations. The two guys that started the field of cryptozoology were both biologists themselves. And there's always been biologists, anthropologists, paleontologists that have been involved in these investigations, despite the fact that the overall scientific community considers it to be a pseudoscience. And this has changed a little bit. So there have been more and more scientists that have gotten involved in investigating cryptids. So these are all from peer-reviewed journals, studying Sasquatch, hair samples. This is the one I was talking about before that showed that in all likelihood, thylacines actually existed up until the 1990s and then died out. So cryptids have captured the public imagination for hundreds of years, all the way going up to the present. There's been a lot of books and movies and video games and all kinds of media that have come from cryptids. The fact that the public really likes something doesn't make it true, but it also doesn't make it false. And I think that's the mistake that some professional scientists make, is if people really like something, that means we can't be interested in this thing. As scientists, we should be skeptical of cryptozoological claims, but we shouldn't dismiss them outright. We benefit from investigating them ourselves. And sometimes amazing discoveries do happen, like this pitcher plant that disappeared, that people thought was extinct in 1918, and then was discovered alive in 2019. Or this group of mollusks. This is one of the Lazarus species I was telling you about. This group of mollusks was thought to be extinct 380 million years ago. No fossils since that time. And then they discovered them alive in 1952. So sometimes really amazing discoveries do happen. Cryptozoology as a field is complicated because, yes, it's not strictly a scientific field. It includes ridiculous pseudoscience and paranormal stuff, and also rigorous, detailed, careful scientific investigation. We should encourage the scientific side of this spectrum and criticize the pseudoscientific side, but we should engage with cryptids. Things that are considered monsters of today may become the established animals of tomorrow. Like this was a sea monster in the 1500s, but then later on was discovered as an actual animal called a narwhal. So who knows if 30 years from now, we'll look back on the Orion pendek as just another animal that exists. So I want to go through some sources. If you want to see some of these sources, if you're online, you can just let me know. But I have some sources that I recommend for cryptozoology in general: alien big cats, thylacine, lake sea monsters. This is some of the sources I used: apes, thunderbirds. And then a little preview. So if you're interested, you're thinking about next week's talk, this is some of the stuff I'm going to cover in that talk that I couldn't get to in this talk. So it should be pretty fun, some of the stuff we're going to get to. All right, thank you very much. I'll take any questions you have. I'll check the chat too, but anyone in the room have any questions?
You're showing one of like the chocolate. It looks like it's pretty like chocolate something that's coming out of the water. What do you think that was?
Which was that one again?
It was like showing like the pictures.
Uh-huh. It was like with apes?
No, the big ship lake.
Oh, oh yeah, the big chunk one. No, I don't remember. I don't know. It kind of doesn't look that much like anything. That one kind of looked a little bit like there was a Loch Ness one that kind of looked like that too, just some really big thing. I mean, sometimes there could be like logs or something, but it didn't exactly look like a log. I'm kind of not sure, to be honest. It doesn't look like a whale or a dolphin or something like that. Yeah.
Paddlefish, I think. Very long.
Oh, the sturgeon?
No, it was found here on the Southern California. coast.
Oh,
That one usually is way deep and very, very deep.
oh, was it the oarfish or no? I think I know what you're talking about, but
It's very flat,
what's,
very long.
it might,
about 30 feet long.
well, that's probably the oarfish because oarfish is the longest fish. Yeah, they are usually really deep. That's right. I showed some footage because sometimes they do come to the surface. So there was a video, but yeah, that's what I think is the explanation for sea serpents, because it would be so rare to see one on the surface, but it would happen. Just like with giant squids, it's very rare for them to come to the surface.
Be marched from whales.
Yep. Yep. Okay. Let me see about any questions in the chat. I'm trying to look here. I don't know if I see any questions. Okay. Okay, here's a question. I'm a little surprised you stated that so many anecdotal can't be wrong. I wouldn't say that an abundance of anecdotal evidence proves that something is true, but I think if you look at the history of discovering species, like how we discovered gorillas, or how we discovered Komodo dragons, or how we discovered platypuses, or how we discovered that new species of tapir, that if a lot of people say that they saw something, that usually means that there's something there. It doesn't prove what it is, but usually there's something. And I think like if you believe this story of like the family where like they seem like, if you look into that story, they seem to be really genuine, that some bird did pick up their child. If you believe that, then that says that some bird did that. It doesn't tell you what it is, but it kind of shows you that it's worth investigating in any case. So I think that's just my position, is if there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, that means it's worth investigating. It doesn't prove, like I wouldn't say Bigfoot is proven just because there's hundreds of sightings, but I think it's worth investigating for that reason, if that makes sense. Any other questions in the room?
Don't have another one. Right. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So yeah, that one is called Attack of the Movie Monsters, because it'll be even more Halloweenish. Like I'm still finishing it right now, but it's mostly done. But it's gonna, yeah, for those in the Zoom as well, if you want to attend the other talk, I can give you a little synopsis. I showed a little preview, but I'm gonna have a big section on giant bugs where I'll get into the Mongolian deathworm, which when I got into it, is kind of more interesting than I thought it would be. But giant bugs, giant spiders, and then there'll be a lot on vampires and werewolves and mummies. So if you're interested in that. And then I have a huge section on mermaids, which again, I got into a lot, even though going in, I was like, well, there's not really that much interesting stuff to say here. But it turned out to be a really cool exploration again of how science operates. And I'm going to get into the aquatic ape hypothesis, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, that should be good. And then if I have time, oh yeah, I'm going to talk about like elves and gnomes and that kind of stuff too. So that's the plan. So you're talking about the orang pendek. That's in Indonesia. That's where the sightings occur. It's called, I can type it in the chat, but it's called the orang pendek. You can look it up. Yeah. But it's in an island of Indonesia. Any other questions? Yeah, yeah. I think that was the island where it was discovered. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. There is some debate on like how late. Like I think originally there was evidence that Homo floresiensis lived even later than that, but that's a little bit debated. Like I think other scientists have said that it was just earlier, but that's one thing I want people to learn too, is from the fossil record, you never know when something disappeared. You just know the last documented time. It lived at least until this point. You find evidence that it lived until 50,000 years ago, doesn't mean that's when it died out. That just means that it lived at least until then. Like I think for paleontology people, they forget that. But like Lazarus taxa should show us that like, yeah, you could have a group disappear for 100 million years. That means the fossil record is pretty imperfect. So you shouldn't assume that just because something doesn't have a fossil, that means it died at that point. I think that's a good lesson to learn. Right. Any other questions in the chat anywhere? Let's see. All right, I guess that's it.